Pawnbroker. Few films in the mid-60s undermined Hollywood's comfort zone quite like The Pawnbroker. Directed by Sidney Lumet and released in the United States in April of 1965, it garnered critical praise for its stark depiction of trauma through the eyes of a Holocaust survivor, portrayed by Rod Steiger. His performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, but audiences were far less receptive. The film's fractured flashbacks, somber tone, and refusal to provide emotional catharsis left many moviegoers perplexed or disoriented. Reports circulated that some theater owners even hesitated to show it, citing concerns over its uncompromising content and unorthodox structure. One particular scene ignited nationwide controversy, a fleeting moment of nudity that tested the production code's limits. When the Motion Picture Association threatened to withhold its seal of approval, Lumet refused to remove the shot. The film premiered regardless, becoming the first American movie to feature nudity, bypass the code, and still land a mainstream distribution. Some film scholars believe this act of resistance hastened the code's downfall. Despite its importance, The Pawnbroker faltered commercially in its own era. While critics commended its craft, many viewers found it too bleak, too disjointed, or simply too alien to the American cinematic taste of the time. In subsequent decades, it's frequently cited as a landmark in independent filmmaking, though in those days, it primarily left audiences puzzled. Seconds. In 1966, Paramount Pictures backed a film that critics applauded as a cerebral masterpiece, while audiences reportedly left screenings bewildered or outright disturbed. Seconds, directed by John Frankenheimer, followed a disillusioned banker who undergoes a secretive medical procedure to fake his death and assume a new identity, only to spiral into psychological ruin. Rock Hudson, cast wildly against type, delivered a performance so stripped of his usual charm that certain reviewers insisted he was nearly unrecognizable. The New York Times described his transformation as startling, while additional voices labeled it a career-defining pivot. James Wong Howe's unsettling cinematography, laced with fisheye lenses and jarring angles, turned mundane suburbia into a visual panic attack. Variety labeled the film a cold, clinical, fascinating study of identity, though the quote is often paraphrased. Despite critical praise, the film was a box office failure. Walkouts were reported, especially during its grim, wordless finale. Some speculate the film's nihilistic tone clashed too hard with a decade leaning into counterculture optimism. Many believed audiences simply weren't ready to see Hudson in such a bleak role. Legends even teased that studio marketing buried the film out of fear it would damage Hudson's image. Retrospectively, Seconds has been embraced as a cult classic, with critics and scholars citing it as an early influence on psychological horror auteurs like David Cronenberg and Darren Aronofsky. At the time, though, it was a commercial misfire. Too strange, too dark, and far too ahead of its time. The Loved One. In 1965, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, in partnership with Filmways Pictures, released The Loved One, a film critics hailed as daring, but most audiences rejected outright. Directed by Tony Richardson and based on Evelyn Waugh's razor-sharp novel, the movie skewered the American funeral industry with a level of satire that pushed the boundaries of what mainstream cinema dared to touch. The promotional tagline, "The motion picture with something to offend everyone," wasn't just marketing, it was a litmus test. Critics admired its audacity and surreal tone, but many viewers left theaters confused, even alienated. The film's fragmented structure, bizarre characters, and macabre humor, like Rod Steiger's unsettling portrayal of Mr. Joyboy and Jonathan Winters playing two equally offbeat roles, left audiences unsure whether they were watching a comedy or a breakdown. Financially, it struggled to find footing. While exact numbers vary, reports from the Times suggest it failed to recover its production costs, a disappointment in the wake of more successful satires like Dr. Strangelove. Stories circulate about internal studio debates over its controversial content, especially as it challenged the limits of the production code, which was still in effect. Its unflinching mockery of death, religion, and Hollywood vanity was simply too much for many moviegoers. With passing years, though, The Loved One gained traction as a cult favorite, with film scholars citing it as a precursor to modern dark comedies. But in its day, it was a cinematic misfit, lauded by critics, rejected by the masses, and left to smolder in the ashes of its own ambition. The Servant. In 1963, Joseph Losey's psychological drama The Servant unsettled critical circles with its icy examination of class and control. Reviewers commended Harold Pinter's stripped-down screenplay for its charged silences and unnerving power reversals. Dirk Bogarde's chilling portrayal of the manipulative manservant earned him the BAFTA for Best British Actor, solidifying his status as a serious dramatic force. Yet while the press admired the film's probing commentary on Britain's eroding class structure, many viewers felt distant. The film's slow pace, claustrophobic setting, and refusal to offer moral certainty made it a challenging watch for casual audiences. Some publications noted that attendees left screenings early, confounded by the absence of a clear protagonist. The Times labeled it a disturbing and brilliant portrait of moral decay, but ticket sales lagged behind the buzz. Without blockbuster numbers to match its critical acclaim, The Servant became a divisive entry. Film historians later proposed that its themes, dependency, role reversal, and psychological manipulation, may have run counter to a public still holding on to post-war social norms. Legends hint that Losey and Pinter purposely concealed meaning beneath layers of ambiguity, encouraging viewers to crack the film's underlying message. Today it's examined in film schools and analyzed in retrospectives, but for the broader public, it remains a chilly, cerebral artifact of a turbulent cinematic era. Petulia. In 1968, Richard Lester, already famous for directing the Beatles films, released Petulia, a movie critics immediately praised for its bold structure and visual experimentation. The New York Times called it a stunning piece of filmmaking, while others likened its fractured narrative to the French New Wave. But audiences? Many were left perplexed. Expecting a breezy Julie Christie romance, they got a detached, non-linear portrait of alienation in a supposedly optimistic era. The film's jarring time jumps and dispassionate tone clashed with the flower power atmosphere of the late 60s. Speculation arose that some theatergoers walked out mid-screening, confused by what felt more like a psychological puzzle than a story. Despite critical support, the film underperformed commercially. Its box office numbers never matched its artistic ambition. Some dared to guess it was simply too ahead of its time. Years down the line, scholars like David Thompson and Jonathan Rosenbaum would revisit Petulia, hailing it as a prophetic critique of the counterculture's hollow promises. Its bleak take on modern relationships, once dismissed as icy, now reads like a warning few were ready to hear. The Trial of Joan of Arc. In 1962, Robert Bresson released The Trial of Joan of Arc, a film that critics praised as a minimalist triumph, while audiences left mostly unimpressed. Robert based the script on historical trial transcripts, though he condensed and adapted them rather than using them word for word. He cast Florence DeLay, a literature student with no acting background, and instructed her to deliver lines with near-total emotional restraint. The result? A film that critics like Jean-Luc Godard reportedly admired. Whispers even claim he once called it Bresson's finest work. It won the special jury prize at the Cannes Film Festival that year, yet it failed to resonate with mainstream audiences. To many viewers, the film felt more like an austere courtroom reenactment than a compelling historical drama. With no musical score, no sweeping speeches, and no cinematic grandstanding, it stood in stark contrast to earlier portrayals, like Ingrid Bergman's fiery performance in Victor Fleming's 1948 version. A number of analysts argued that audiences, conditioned by Hollywood's emotionally charged epics, found Robert's clinical tone cold, even lifeless. Box office numbers backed that up. The project lagged at the box office, and outside of cinephile circles, it faded quickly. Robert's refusal to cater to narrative convention, his rejection of emotional cues, dramatic arcs, and traditional acting, was viewed by some as artistic purity, and by others as alienating. Eventually, though, the film's reputation has shifted. Scholars now cite it as a key entry in Robert's spiritual canon, alongside Diary of a Country Priest and Pickpocket. Film historian Keith Reeder has referred to it as a masterclass in restraint, and director Paul Schrader has repeatedly credited Robert's work, including this film, as a major influence on his own. Still, The Trial of Joan of Arc remains one of the clearest cases from the Golden Age where critical acclaim clashed head-on with public indifference. The Goddess. Released in 1958, The Goddess aimed a harsh spotlight on the machinery of fame, and audiences recoiled. Written by Paddy Chayefsky and directed by John Cromwell, The film stripped away the allure of stardom to reveal a portrait of psychological unraveling. Kim Stanley's performance as a fictionalized Marilyn Monroe-type figure was hailed by critics as fearless and raw. The New York Times praised it as a harrowing display of emotional realism. But for moviegoers expecting a glamorous melodrama, the film's bleak tone and unflinching themes, emotional trauma, addiction, and isolation, felt like a betrayal. Speculation spread that the studio, unsure how to market such a grim character study, leaned into misleading promotional tactics that painted it as a traditional star vehicle. That disconnect proved fatal. The Goddess bombed at the box office and was discreetly shelved, dismissed by many as too depressing. But many years afterward, film scholars began re-evaluating it, pointing to its thematic parallels with modern biopics like Blonde and Judy. Some even speculate it laid the groundwork for a new kind of celebrity narrative, one that exposes rather than idolizes. Today, The Goddess stands not as a failure, but as a film that challenged its era's appetite for illusion and paid the price for it. The Quiet American. When MGM released The Quiet American in 1958, it had all the makings of a prestige picture. Adapted from a best-selling novel helmed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz and fronted by war hero-turned-actor Audie Murphy. Yet despite its pedigree, the film landed awkwardly with both critics and audiences. Instead of embracing Graham Greene's original anti-interventionist message, the adaptation softened it, turning a sharp critique of American foreign policy in Vietnam into something far more ambiguous. Critics were divided. Some admired the ambition, but many felt the film neutered the novel's political bite. Whispers abounded that studio executives, wary of post-McCarthyist backlash, pressured Mankiewicz to dilute the film's message to avoid controversy. Some even speculate that unofficial government interests influenced the script's direction. The casting of Murphy, a symbol of American valor, only added to the confusion. Viewers expecting a patriotic wartime drama were met instead with a murky, morally conflicted story. The film struggled at the ticket counter, failing to connect with the public. It wasn't until decades later, when the 2002 remake restored Greene's original tone, that audiences and critics alike began to reassess the missteps of the 1958 version. Today, it stands as a curious artifact of Cold War-era cinema, a film that tried to speak out, but ended up playing it safe. The Young Lions. In 1958, The Young Lions arrived with grand ambitions, showcasing a cast that included Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Dean Martin, under Edward Dmytryk's direction. Critics applauded its gravity and ethical intricacies, but the general public responded with less enthusiasm. While reviewers admired Brando's measured portrayal of a conflicted German officer, numerous viewers found the character's sympathetic depiction deeply unnerving, particularly in a post-war context still sensitive with lingering memories. Variety described the film as a serious, if uneven, exploration of war's psychological toll, while the New York Times praised its performances and scope. Nevertheless, its fragmented storyline and contemplative pace, spanning over 2.5 hours, left many feeling disengaged. Measured against the grand-scale, action-heavy triumph of The Bridge on the River Kwai from the previous year, The Young Lions encountered difficulties connecting at the box office. Some propose that Brando's contentious role alienated standard audiences. Others cite the film's absence of a triumphant resolution. Rumors even suggest that last-minute studio interference over the film's tone led to cuts that diminished its emotional resonance. Despite it all, it stands as a noteworthy instance of a film that critics revered for its boldness, while ticket buyers quietly stepped away. Wild River. Elia Kazan's 1960 film Wild River landed with critics but barely registered with audiences. Starring Montgomery Clift and Lee Remick, the film tackled the Tennessee Valley Authority's forced displacement of rural families during the New Deal. Critics praised its layered performance and political nuance. The New York Times highlighted its restrained direction and emotional complexity, but for general audiences it was a tough sell. The pacing was slow, the tone somber, and the themes, especially its early civil rights commentary, felt too heavy. Wild River had a limited release and underperformed at the box office, ending its run quickly. Some film historians suggest the film's progressive stance, including its empathetic portrayal of black characters and critique of federal authority, may have alienated conservative viewers in the South. Others point to its quiet tone and lack of star-powered spectacle as reasons it failed to connect. Today, it's often cited as a forgotten milestone, an early, overlooked entry in the wave of socially conscious cinema that would define the late 60s. The Chase. By the time Columbia Pictures released The Chase in 1966, expectations were sky high. With Arthur Penn directing and a cast that included Marlon Brando, Jane Fonda, and Robert Redford, the film looked like a prestige drama in the making. Instead, it landed with a thud. While some critics admired its ambition, grappling with themes like racial tension, political decay, and small-town hysteria, many reviews were scathing. The New York Times called it a mess of pretensions, and audience reactions were equally lukewarm. The pacing was erratic, the tone uneven, and the plot felt like it had been stitched together from several different drafts. Behind the scenes, friction was brewing. Speculation ran wild that Spiegel, fearing backlash over the film's darker themes, ordered last-minute edits that stripped away key scenes. Legends teased that entire subplots were cut, leaving the final product disjointed and confusing. Brando's performance as Sheriff Calder was subdued, even stoic, far from his usual bravado, which some later critics praised as quietly powerful, though it went mostly unnoticed at the time. Financially, it fell short, failing to recoup its substantial budget. In subsequent decades, The Chase has earned a modest reappraisal among film scholars, who see it as a bold, if flawed, attempt at social commentary. Still, it remains a cautionary tale, a film with all the right ingredients that never quite came together. The Tarnished Angels. In 1957, director Douglas Sirk, renowned for his glossy Technicolor melodramas, took an unexpected detour with The Tarnished Angels, a black-and-white CinemaScope adaptation of William Faulkner's novel Pylon. Starring Rock Hudson and Dorothy Malone, the film traded glamour for grit, exploring themes of moral collapse, post-war disillusionment, and the emotional wreckage of fading heroes. Critics were intrigued. The New York Times praised its visual starkness and psychological depth, calling it a bold break from Sirk's usual fare. Yet mainstream viewers remained unmoved. Compared to the box office triumph of All That Heaven Allows, this one barely registered. Universal International's ledgers showed disappointing returns, and the film quietly slipped into obscurity. Some film historians argue that its commercial failure had less to do with quality and more to do with timing. Mid-century America, they claim, wasn't ready for a film that stripped away cinematic fantasy and faced existential dread. Whispered anecdotes suggest studio executives were uneasy about its somber tone, but greenlit it out of loyalty to Sirk. Many years on, The Tarnished Angels has been reconsidered as one of his most audacious works, earning a cult following among scholars and cinephiles who view it as a rare Hollywood meditation on failure, both personal and cultural. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.